Hello and welcome back to episode 4 of the Power of Youth podcast. Today we will be discussing youth protests and we have some very special guests with us today. We have Daisy and Vivian, organisers and people involved with the school strike for climate. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thanks for having us. Yeah, thank you.
So I think to start with, we just want to ask you a broad question just to get to know you and what you've been doing in the community. And that is, what are you passionate about and where has that led you in the last 12 months, let's say?
That's a pretty big question, but I think for most of us, quite an obvious answer. Something that I am really passionate about is climate change, or actually, getting climate action. And so I've known about the threat of climate change for a really long time. Both of my parents work in, renewable energy fields, so I've always been aware of the threat that climate change poses, and it seemed ridiculous to me that the rest of our society was not as aware as I was of this kind of impending doom. And so in November of 2018, I heard about Greta Thunberg, who was striking every Friday in Sweden to get climate action from her government. And I heard about her international call out for November 30th. So kids around the world will strike on November 30th. And I thought that sounded freaking incredible. So I wanted to join in and do that. And that's how I got started with School Strike for Climate. And yeah, since then I've been campaigning, organising. I am from the electorate of Warringah, where in the last federal election we got rid of Tony Abbott, which was a huge victory.
Very nice.
So that's a little bit about me.
And I think for me, what I'm really passionate about is helping people. And I think, being a city kid, I hadn't been until a couple of months ago with the smoke, but I hadn't been directly affected by climate change. And I think, seeing the science made me realise that if no one else was going to take action, then I should. And luckily, hundreds of thousands, now millions of young people joined me in that, same line of thought. And I think we've really been able to grow a huge amount, over these past few months coming together. I was actually at the UN climate conference in December last year, and I'd never met any of these kids before, but we all instantly became really close friends because we were there for the same reason. We were fighting for the same thing. And I think it's really helped break down barriers for me, around the world. And it's really amazing to see so many young people take their future into their own hands, but at the same time terrifying.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think obviously the youth protest is something which has really captured the attention of people in all walks of life over the past few months. But I'm just wondering, why did you decide that they were the best course of action to achieve your goal? Why did you decide to start them and that's what you wanted to do to achieve the goals that you had in mind?
Well, again, it wasn't really our idea. It started in Sweden, I guess. But the great thing about the school strike, and the thing that really makes it very effective, is that we as children, we really have the moral high ground, because it's the coming generation, our generation of young people, we are the ones who will be the most affected by climate change, and there's no way to get around that. And I think that's part of why the strikes are so effective, because there's no way, unless you're really, very, very right-leaning and just complete climate denier, there's kind of no way to get around the fact that we're striking because our futures really are on the line. Not to mention that the strike is incredible just because they bring so many people together. Daisy?
Yeah, I think the reason why we decided to start striking, and I think, obviously Greta was the first one, but by the same token, we also had to make that decision, was this really the best course of action? And I think we've been left with no alternative. We've gone out on the weekends, we've talked in class, we've sent letters to politicians, we've been loud on social media, and unfortunately none of it has cut through. And for us, this is the only thing that really has cut through other strikes, and we've only missed a few days of school. It's not like we're missing our actual coursework, and I think so for us it's a really effective and efficient method of actually cutting through the political bubble. Unfortunately, we're yet to see action from this government, but we've certainly kept a lot of people on their toes. And with the bushfire crisis now, I've really seen a shift in how the public responds to talk about climate change, and also how the public deals with the government's gobsmacking inability to tackle this crisis.
Yeah, but just quickly there as well, I completely agree with that. And just jumping back to the quote before about, us, we really do hardly miss a lot of school through the strikes, and really it's a lot of our free time that goes into it. And one of our lead organisers in Sydney, who graduated this year, she got an ATAR of over 99. So that really disproves that argument that it's bad for our schoolwork. I just wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah.
Well, with this whole missing school situation, why do you think it is? Because out of a lot of this, the biggest reactions I ever saw was adults complaining that students were missing a day of school. Why do you think they've chosen to latch onto that rather than latch onto the message that you're trying to put forth?
I think for those adults that are responding like that, there is a genuine concern that kids are missing school. But at the same time, I think it's more this astonishment that young people will actually take to the streets to get what they need. And I think there was a bit of shock value to it, which kind of garnered that response. But also, I don't think adults generally like young people calling them out for their inaction. And for me, when I was talking to a lot of people who had that response, they were kind of mad that they hadn't seen the action in the first place, and they thought it should be up to the government. Young people shouldn't have to be out on the streets for this. But unfortunately we do. And again, with the bushfires and with kids actually being forced to miss a day of school because of the risk of smoke or the fires.
Or the risk of their school being burnt down. I mean, it's just at this point, it's like the hypocrisy of it is really exposed, when all these, right-wing politicians are, you're in huge uproar because they're missing one day of school, and then and then children's schools burn down because they cut funding and didn't have enough plans in place to prevent the horrible fires that we're having at the moment, or to prevent the severity of the fires. That's really hypocritical.
Yeah.
Like you've touched on before, the government has been seen to be lacking in making new policy changes. And I just wanted to ask you about youth protesting, because the point of protesting is to initiate change by pressuring the government to take action. And the reason the government responds to it is to ensure the voters are happy. But because the foundation of youth protest is the youth, do you think the government will respond in the same way as voting age protesters? And are they more likely to wait until you are of voting age to make these suggestions part of their policy?
I think the government is still under the impression that they have quiet Australians on their side. And I think part of the reason, obviously, that they haven't taken action is because they don't see, as you said, people who can't vote yet as a worry. However, after September 20th, having talked to a few politicians, I did see a bit of a shift inside as people started to panic because adults as well as kids were coming out on the streets. And also now I think they're facing a fair bit of pressure. You've seen a lot of change in the rhetoric from the government. Still nowhere near enough, but still a fair bit of change in the midst of this crisis because Australians who've lost their homes, some have lost their lives, and people are coming out and they're saying this is not enough. Maybe, they might say, I've been a Liberal voter, but I cannot endorse this any longer. I will not be voting Liberal in the next election. And we're starting to see the government just panic a little bit because they're realising that their inaction is actually going to cost them votes. It's going to cost them their government. And I would say what we need to do following this is need to keep up the pressure, need to keep highlighting the government's the government's lack of action, but I think they're doing a pretty good job of that themselves. And we'll see where it takes us towards the next election.
Yeah, I agree with that. So just jumping quickly. But something that has been really interesting to see, especially it's because of the toxic smoke that's covering Sydney and a lot of parts of Australia, is that people who, this is the first time that people have been directly impacted by climate change, other than, like hotter days, which are easy to curb if you stay inside in the air conditioning. But, this is the first time that people have really been affected by climate change in a very, very real way. And it's mobilized people who otherwise wouldn't have been interested in the climate change debate. So you're seeing, for example, like suburban moms who can't take their kids outside and they're going crazy because they have to keep their kids inside the house. It's very little things like that, but all the same, they are being affected and they are waking up and wanting to take action. So I think that's a change that we're seeing now, and it also definitely has made the politicians aware that the politicians are aware that this change is occurring as well, which remains to be seen how much and in what capacity they respond to that.
Yeah, and it's really sad to see that it's taken this catastrophic event for people to start talking about climate change. And as of Monday 6th, I've just got some statistics here. 7 million hectares of land have burned, 1,700 homes have been destroyed, 23 people have been killed, and an astonishing 500 million animals have perished. So it is really sad that this has occurred, but it's also really good to see, like you said, this has initiated people's thoughts about climate change and people's decisions of how to live in the future.
Yeah, totally. And just on that point as well, the government, one of their main excuses for not taking climate action is that it's so expensive. But, they also have to realise that there's a cost of not taking action. And this is it, 23 lives. I'm not sure what you said, 17,000 homes, is it?
1,700, which is still so many.
But still, it's a lot. And, 7 million hectares, it's so much that's been destroyed, and that is the cost of not acting.
And just talking about it from an economic perspective, it's $2 billion that this is costing Australia, and Australia is already heading into a recession. The only reason we were going to get a budget surplus was because the government actually cut funding to a number of areas, including the arts. And so what we're seeing is we're not only seeing the cost in lives, but what's actually going to freak out the government is the cost economically, because Liberals are generally pretty, their heads are pretty in the economic game. And, when we're looking at a crisis to actually get people on their feet and actually demand action, the reason for that, I think, is my theory is that unless you're actually personally affected right here, right now, by something, especially climate change, it's very easy to push it to the back of your mind because it's not relevant to you. You can't see it happening. You can't feel it happening. So it's very easy to distance yourself from it. And so what we're seeing is now that people are actually being affected. Like Sydney today, I walked out of my house and ash was raining down on the pavement. That is climate change. We are being affected by it right here, right now. And I think that's why we're seeing a lot more anger. And I think, around the country this Friday, Extinction Rebellion and uni students for climate justice will be putting on a protest, which has tens of thousands of people interested or going, which I think is a really good indication that particularly if this is happening in the school holidays, we don't see protests that big. And I would say that, this Friday has the potential to be huge. And the reason for that is people are being directly affected by climate change. They want to see action and they're going to take to the streets to get it.
Yeah, well, one of the really interesting quotes, I guess, from the Prime Minister that has really stuck with me during this bushfire crisis is that he said quite early on that there should be no knee-jerk reactions, as he put it, to this crisis. And I find it interesting because when you look at another natural disaster that happened recently with the volcano in New Zealand, the response we got from the Prime Minister then, I thought was the one we should have been getting for the bushfires at the time. And I just want to know what your thoughts on that are.
I haven't seen that response, but I think, what I would say is that this Prime Minister lacks empathy, and I think his literal answer, I know someone who used to be in the Pentecostal religion, and his literal response is thoughts and prayers. And so with the volcano, it's a tangible, it's a fixable issue. It's not like he can't control the volcano. It's not his fault. It's very easy for him to get in and actually help out. Whereas when it comes to an issue such as the fires, unfortunately, it is a political issue because he looks really bad because he hasn't taken action, and he's been advocating against climate action for not only months, but years now. And so for him, it would be very easy to shut down and kind of panic. And instead, he's kind of putting on this smug facade because he doesn't know what else to do. I think he's personally, I think he's really incapable of understanding human emotion. And I think you've seen him using his wife and his children as a shield in front of the media. And that's because he's panicking because he doesn't know how to interact with the public with something that he is so clearly partially responsible for.
I mean, my opinion of the Prime Minister is not as scathing as Daisy's, but I do agree in the sense that, with a volcano in New Zealand, again, that's something where it's easy to, offer empathy and support because you're not directly responsible for it. And, of course, he's not directly responsible for the fires in the sense that he didn't go out and set them himself, but he did. He was warned months in advance about the severity of this year's fire season, and still chose to cut funding. And then when the fires got really, really bad, he went on holiday to Hawaii. And that's not to say he doesn't deserve to go on holiday, just not while the nation's in a crisis and he hasn't been doing anything about it. So I think he's realised now. I don't think it's because of a lack of empathy. I just think he miscalculated the whole thing, didn't realise how bad it was going to look for him, and now he's trying to backtrack and win back voters by being out on the front lines. But it's a little too little, too late, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think over the last month, I do believe that Scott Morrison has changed his thoughts and he has moved positively. We started with the whole Hawaii debacle. He was still a climate skeptic, and now he's kind of moved towards saying, okay, it's real. I believe that there's a link. Over the last week, he's definitely started some initiatives to support. I'm just wondering, what do you think he should be doing more now?
To be honest, I've grown up in the political bubble. My dad is Albanese's speechwriter, and I know a lot of politicians, and I interact with them on a semi-regular basis. And there is very little faith about what Scott Morrison will actually do in the wake of these fires, particularly in terms of climate action. So he's doing right now what people demanded of him months ago. So to, give relief to those who suffered from the bushfires, to pay the RFS volunteers or to compensate them. And he's only done that under political pressure. And I don't want to sound like an asshole, but he is doing the bare minimum. And he's only doing it now because he's going to look even more horrific if he doesn't. And he's also said that he will not change the government's climate policy. And we desperately need to change our climate policy because while we may not be the largest domestic emitter in the world, we're the highest emitter per capita. We're also the third largest exporter of emissions behind Russia and Saudi Arabia, who really aren't, a couple of countries who want to be in a top three with. And so we have a lot to answer for in terms of climate action. Undoubtedly, Australia's inaction has contributed to this crisis. And so what we need to see, what we're seeing, and this is part of the problem with the short-termism in politics, is we're seeing more of a Band-Aid approach to this issue, where we're sticking a Band-Aid on this crisis and saying it's all going to be okay. But eventually that Band-Aid's going to come off and that scab is going to break open and start bleeding again. And we can't afford to let that happen. And as the planet gets warmer, Australia needs to take action. Obviously, there needs to be global action. But when Australia stands up at a world conference and advocates for climate action, but is not doing its part, it's really hypocritical, and we do have a big part to play ourselves in this. And as Viv said, the cost of inaction will be deadly. 30 years ago, we should have been taking climate action, and it would have been a lot cheaper then. Unfortunately, our action is going to have to be a lot more drastic, and it's going to have to be a steeper decline in emissions now, and it's going to cost more. But down the track, it is going to be unbelievably expensive. And, how many more lives is it going to cost? How many more homes is it going to cost before this government finally gets us and actually think we really need to take action? And they get out there and they apologise and they put together a real climate policy that is actually going to put Australia on the map as a country that's taking climate action.
So on the School Strike for Climate website, there are 3 main requests that are on there that are at the centre of the goal of your youth protests. And those are no new coal, oil and gas projects, including the Adani mine, 100% renewable energy generation and exports by 2030, and fund a just transition and job creation for all fossil fuel workers and communities. So if you guys were in government right now, what would you be doing differently, and how do you think these goals can be put into action without ruining the Australian economy?
Well, I think it really depends on what level of government we'd be in. But I think, the phrasing is interesting. You say without ruining the economy. I think while definitely there are ways to deal with the climate crisis where, we could actually turn, into a source of revenue. For example, changing agriculture practices at the moment. So I think there's predictions that global soil will not be fertile anymore in 60 years if we don't change farming practices now. And so there's ways to do like regenerative farming and things like that actually will bring in revenue. But I think we've left it too late now to. As there is with any period of change, it's going to be uncomfortable for a bit. It's going to be new, and in that sense, there will be some unrest when Australia switches over to carbon neutral because it will impact the economy. But I think, the surefire way of running the Australian economy into the ground is not taking climate action, and any steps that we would take, to bring down emissions, to be prepared for the impacts of climate change, those to save us money. So, that's what I think in terms of economy. And as a politician, I guess I'd be trying to implement climate action in any way I could.
Yeah, I think that we obviously should have invested in renewables a long time ago. It's an economically viable system of creating energy and of creating revenue. And as well as that, just getting one question, a possible question out of the way, a lot of people ask me about nuclear power. Now, 2 decades ago, that might have been economically viable, but it's now a lot more expensive, and it's just, it's not really an economically wise option for Australia to be investing in nuclear energy when we have so much available in terms of solar, wind, hydro. And I think what Australia needs to do now is we haven't even begun the groundwork to actually transition away from fossil fuel, from the fossil fuel industry. And I think the problem that arises from that is that because we have no problem, when politicians eventually realize, down the track, that we needed to transition, decades ago, it's going to be a drastic turnaround that's going to leave a lot of people out of jobs. So what we need to see is a just transition policy, and that's the school strike's third demand. And what I mean when I say that is we actually need to be taking care of our workers in the fossil fuel industry. And so that means providing jobs. That means trying to keep those communities together because their identities and their livelihoods are tied into the coal industry. And a lot of these towns are economically reliant on the fossil fuel industry. And so what we need to do is we don't even have a plan for these towns and for these people at the moment. And I think that's a huge failure on all parties' parts, because they haven't put anything together. And I think if I was in government, that's something I would be focusing on right here, right now. And there are now a lot of communities, aside from the fossil fuel industry, that are being affected by climate change, that are losing their jobs. A lot of regional communities have lost all their economic, their economic stability due to these fires. And so I think, not only do we need to focus on getting those communities back up off the ground, but we also need to focus on keeping these towns and these families functioning as we transition to renewable energy. And so, and another thing, another thing is that, when transitioning away from the fossil fuel industry, a lot of people go, well, why can't they just work in the renewable energy industry? Well, those jobs aren't unionised. They're often only temporary and in construction. They don't last forever. They're not the only viable solution to this. So there's a lot of planning involved. It's not going to be an easy process. We can't sugarcoat it. But at the same time, if I was in government, what I would expect to be seeing is people actually sitting down and going, how can we transition? How can we keep Australia on the map economically, and how can we keep these families and communities together? Because currently, communities in the fossil fuel industry are being kept up at the expense of people in these regional communities who are being affected by the fires. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's just adding on to that. I think that's one, kind of misconception, and, it may be rooted a little bit in the truth, but the conception is kind of that, all these climate movements, they don't care about, I guess, the fate of the coal workers and things like that. And I think, previously there's even been a little bit of an antagonistic relationship between between the people in these coal-reliant communities and people who are working towards climate action. But it doesn't need to be that way. And we all want the same. We all want the same outcome. The reason that I strike for the climate is because I want a future that where we really have the best for everyone, and that includes people from these coal-reliant communities. And we just want to do we want to do the best we can by everyone. And so at the moment that's not being done because, as Daisy said, there's no plan in place. Yeah,
great. I think obviously politics is a huge force in creating change and momentum, and also shifting community perspectives. But I think another aspect which is almost just as influential is the media. And I'm just interested in how, if you could control the media, how would you control it? How do you think it can support this movement better?
I think what we need to see from the media is reliable reporting, and that's on both sides of politics. And at the moment, I've just seen spectacular levels of bias from papers such as The Australian, which I know has a very low readership, but a lot of people in the political bubble read it. And when it comes to reporting on the bushfire crisis, one day when the government monumentally buggered up, if it had been Labor or Liberal, it should have been on the front of the paper. But instead, they were criticising Labor for some reason. They were also attacking the ABC, they were attacking student activists, and they were claiming there was some Islamic terror threat. And after reading all of those articles, you can, there was no factual basis to, I think, 3 of them, and they were the headlines for that day. And at the same time, talking about that, but I also want to mention the project in there. They spliced a video of a woman who they showed in a 3-second clip being introduced to Scott Morrison, and she said, "He's not my prime minister," and everyone went wild, and they were like, "Oh, good on her, she's a pensioner, she's getting out fighting fires, and she's confronting the prime minister." But she was actually saying that she's British and that Boris Johnson is her prime minister. And I think that level, that reporting was quite irresponsible, and it also looks to discredit people who are actually trying to get the government to take some action and calling it out on its inaction. So I, really would love to see journalists kind of And, you know, when I say journalists, there are, you know, the Murdochs are undoubtedly a huge influence behind the media in the world today. And I don't think that's a good thing, because I think reporting should be objective and done without personal bias, although there's always going to be some opinion involved. And I think what we really need to see is journalists out there and actually reporting the news. And I've seen a lot of papers and a lot of media do that, but at the same time, there's still this kind of flare up of the political debate. And as we've seen, like, you know, climate deniers still getting a voice in the media, and by giving them a voice in the media, you are essentially, you know, giving that side of the debate a lot more credibility than it deserves, because it's not relying on any scientific consensus. And often it's funded by the fossil fuel industry. And so I think, you know, our media plays a huge role in politics, not as big as it used to be because of the role of social media now. But I think, you know, given that social media is so unreliable, why does our media have to be? And yeah.
I mean, I think in my opinion, I definitely agree that, you know, there needs to be more truth in journalism. And, you know, I can compare it almost to the anti-vaccine thing. You know, the problem with it really echoes that debate, like with climate change, in the sense that, you know, I think it's something like 98% of doctors, or even 99% of doctors, say that vaccines aren't harmful, or, you know, they might carry some side effects, but it's no way as bad as the anti-vaxxers make it seem. But then the anti-vaxxers, they're given so much attention by the media, and, you know, they have so many of their own websites and blog posts and, you know, social media pages, that it seems like the debate is, the debate is almost 50-50. And I think that a similar thing has been happening in, you know, the right-wing press and the Murdoch press. And that's also echoed on social media, that, you know, we have, 97% of scientists who believe that who have proven that climate change is having these disastrous impacts, such as bushfires, floods, you know, extended heat waves. So huge problems environmentally, but also socially, because they impact on health and infrastructure. So, you know, you have 97% of scientists saying that, but then you have the media distorting it and, you know, denying the link between climate change and these bushfires, and then the debate seems a lot less clear than it actually is. And I think that's a huge, huge problem. And then, not to mention, you know, I would call it a scam, to be honest. You know, the Murdoch press blaming the Greens for the bushfires, even though they had absolutely no control.
Yeah, well, one thing I've always found interesting is that you said there that 97% statistics. You know, for me, if someone went and saw 100 doctors because they were feeling ill, and 97 of those doctors said you were sick and you really desperately need some help, but 3 said no, I think the vast majority of people would then go with would ignore the 3,
and
that said action. And take action, whereas for some reason it seems to be really, really different with something as big as the climate. And, you know, you have, I think the biggest offenders are publications like, you know, Sky News, where you have, you know, the characters like Andrew Bolt and Paul Murray really pressing these anti-climate change stances, and, you know, finding those 3 scientists who are who tend to be very highly discredited. But to find those 3, to find those 3,
you're exactly right,
that
and that's
push
the perfect comparison. It's a perfect comparison, because, you know, that's exactly right. If you were told by 97 doctors that you had cancer and needed treatment, then you would get treatment. You wouldn't just because 3 doctors told you wouldn't risk your life like that. And that's exactly the approach that governments internationally need to take, because, you know, like, climate change has been it's not up for debate anymore. But even if it were, you would still want to prevent that risk if it would be that detrimental to you. So it's kind of mind-boggling that that so little has been done. I think part of that, in my personal opinion, is because climate change is such a huge, big, scary thing. It's absolutely terrifying that people, rather than deal with it, tend to kind of shut down and ignore it. I think that's kind of been the response that we've seen in politics recently, or on the other hand, that it's because you can't see it and it's not real until it's at your front door, basically, that it's also easier to ignore.
Like you said, even if climate change wasn't real, let's just pretend it isn't and there is no real threat, fossil fuels will eventually run out anyway. So it is beneficial for us anyway to start investing in renewable infrastructure for the future.
Yeah, totally. And the same thing goes for the more climate-friendly, carbon neutral possibilities in agriculture and infrastructure. Regenerative farming just makes so much more sense than the way we currently farm the land. And same thing goes for example, electric vehicles, ride sharing and more public transport. All these options, they make a lot more sense than going with diesel and having these huge amounts of traffic and congestion on our roads.
Yeah, I just want to look at one different aspect of protest as well, which is getting a bit more scrutiny. The one that comes to mind is the ones in Brisbane where you've got protesters like duct taping themselves to streets. You've got them blocking out roads and stopping traffic, having people going to work and then they're just stuck on the road for hours. Just those things which really stop the flow of a city. And I just want to know what your thoughts are on those really extreme types of protests, because I feel that often, because they're so extreme, they detract from the actual message that those people are trying to get across.
I want to stand in solidarity with all of those who've gone out to demand climate action. But of course, I think, that there is action that's really going to garner positive attention, and then there is action that is not. And for me, that kind of presence in Australia is that, the getting out and standing in, sitting in the middle of the road and duct taping, and people duct taping themselves and things. I think, it can be justified, but at the same time, I think in this political climate, particularly Australia is such an anti-protest country. We like to talk about how we don't care about authority, but we have a remarkably unhealthy deference to it, I would say. So I think that it negatively affects the climate movement because people then interpret it as lefty hippies. And even if they do agree with taking climate action, they don't want to identify as that. And so I think, the inconveniences, excuse my language, royally pissed a lot of people off. I think it's made a lot of people concerned that we're not going to get the climate action because of those protests. And while I think there was a lot of effort and thought that went into them, I really genuinely don't think that they helped. And what I do think helps is when it's an inclusive protest that invites everyone out into the streets, regardless of which side of politics you stand on. And I think when everyone is given that option to go out and have it be a safe protest, that's when you see the people who generally wouldn't come out in the streets for anything. They think this is a safe environment for me to use my voice, for me to stand in solidarity with something and express my opinion. And I think, that's kind of the reason the strikes have been so big. But I also think that's part of the reason, this Friday there's a protest, which is generally people angry at the government over their inaction, but it's not promising anything illegal. It's not saying there's going to be any violence. I think it's run by XR as well. And it's just inviting people to come out and take a stand. And I think that's a really good thing. And I'd say that's probably where we're going to see the most change, whereas smaller protests that are more drastic haven't really helped the movement from my perspective.
Yeah, I would agree with Daisy in the sense that, the big strides like what School Strike for Climate has been doing, and also, taking a completely different movement like the women's marches, those have been really successful because they're inclusive, they get really big, they get a lot of media attention, and people feel safe and, enjoy going to those protests, I would say. I think something like, that a few months ago, Greenpeace activists, they abseiled off the Harbour Bridge, things like that. I wouldn't even really call them protests. They're just kind of stunts. And while I don't necessarily think they detract from the movement, because they're still definitely raising awareness and, get people talking about it. But I also think it's not the right way. I think it's not the right way to go about demanding action, because they can be done in a lot more inclusive, safe ways where you really get everybody involved rather than making a stunt.
Yeah, well, that's something I think's good about the youth protest movement, is that that the fact that you can attract 300,000 kids to one event rather than just say 2 or 3 people abseiling down the Harbour Bridge. Your average Australian seeing that in the news or reading about that on Facebook is going to see those 3 people who do that stunt as quite isolated, irresponsible, careless kind of people, whereas when you see a group of maybe 300,000 gathered, that's a real oh wow, okay, this has a real support behind it, maybe there's a bit of credence to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I knew that action with the abseiling down from the Harbour Bridge. I knew what was happening, and there was a lot of excitement around it. And I think from memory something went wrong and they weren't able to unfurl a banner, so it ended up looking pretty weak. And I think it could have made a real statement. But as you said, I think illegal actions like that, I think while I do think they're warranted, I also think that they're not really you have to be, it's different. We're different to other countries. In Europe, people are quite ready to go out in the street, squish up against each other and really, demand what they want. But here in Australia, we have to do a bit more of a gentle coaxing for people to get out in the streets. They don't want to face retribution. They also generally don't, there's a lot of there's kind of this epidemic globally of, saying, I don't care about politics, or my vote doesn't count, or my voice doesn't count, because people are seeing themselves consistently failed by our democracy. And so I think, in Australia, you have to be a lot gentler. You have to come out, sit down and have a conversation with someone. You have to kind of joke about it. And while while we don't want to compromise and we want to just get out in the streets and say, you need to take action right now, it's a bit more complex than that, and unfortunately we have to be willing to go to the yards. And when we're thinking about taking action, it can't be to satisfy our own ego. What we really have to do is we need to sit down and really analyze the situation and think, could that, is it more likely, are we more likely to see positive change come from this than negative? And unfortunately, while a lot of people are really amazing and they're incredible activists, everyone, makes mistakes along the way. I certainly have, and I've only been in this game for a year. And I think, there are some actions that just aren't thought through as much as they need to be in terms of whether or not it's going to change the political landscape at all. But certainly if it is it going to do it in a negative or positive way?
Yeah, cool. Do you think climate change and solving climate change, does that need to, at this point in time, does it need to start at the top end or the bottom end? Does it need to start with the politicians, or does it need to start with the people and individuals in their own lives and in their own households?
I think that needs to come from both ends, honestly. And I think because we really are on a clock with taking climate action, we don't have time to debate where it starts from. In saying that, people, there's kind of a difference between I'd say the gravitas of individual action and then political action. We know that's the only way we will be able to get Australia carbon neutral is by pushing this across the line on a political scale. Individual action, it's so important, but it is not enough. It just cannot be enough when we're in this race against time. So, individual action is very important, and it does lead to kind of growing movements such as vegetarian and veganism. As much as they get made fun of, it is something really important, and it is making a difference. But it just cannot be understated how important the political response is to this, and we have no hopes of becoming carbon neutral or stopping the climate crisis without political action.
Sorry, I keep adding on to things, but I would say that while individual action is, yes, it's important, and I'm vegetarian, and yesterday I went on a 9-hour train ride to avoid getting on a 45-minute flight. And, that's more drastic than most people are willing to do, but it's also more drastic than a lot of people have the capacity to do. And so, every individual has, they've got economic reasons, or they have personal health reasons, or family reasons, or religious reasons for not being able to totally invest in individual sustainability. And that is totally understandable. And, part of the reason for that is that we have to work with the system that we've got. And currently the system that we've got doesn't encourage individual sustainability. It doesn't make it an easy lifestyle for everyone. So you really have to go the extra yards. And it's not necessarily more expensive to live sustainably, but it can be. Even, getting the train home yesterday was more expensive than getting on a flight. And so I think, it's great to see. I've seen a lot of people really step out over the last few months. But yeah, as Viv said, without political action, without action at the top, without corporations actually investing responsibly in renewable energy and in more sustainable agriculture, I think we won't see the change that we absolutely need to see.
Yeah, if I can make a quick comparison, because this happened to me the other day, and I was thinking about it. So I was at Macca's as you do, and I got a frozen Coke, and I was thinking, maybe I won't get a straw because plastic bad, we don't like that. But then it occurred to me that I can take or leave a straw today, and it won't even make a dent in the whole operation. But if McDonald's changed to paper straws, or whatever, if they made a change in that way, it would do way more than me choosing not to take a straw one time. So I think that's kind of how I think about it. That's watering down individual action a little bit and giving it less credit than it deserves. But, it really does, I think, goes to show that we can't achieve it without political action.
Like you've touched on, we need everybody on board to save the planet. So do you have hope in the Australian public that they will make sacrifices in their everyday lifestyles for the good of the planet, or do you think it's a lost cause?
I think we can expect to see more Australians looking at their lifestyles and taking action. But as I said, I just think, it's not a super viable option for many Australians. And, particularly when people are already struggling with the bushfires and are already being directly affected by climate change, it's a lot more difficult to change up your lifestyle. But I do think, at the moment, in terms of climate action, we really just need to see the government take those first steps. Even baby steps is not enough, but they haven't taken them yet. So for me, it's like I'd love to see people taking action as individuals to live more sustainably. But I think the emergency that we're in demands immediate political action straight from the top.
Yeah, awesome. I think just to close with, for today's podcast, our podcast is all about, sharing youth's perspective on global issues, and we really do believe that youth have power to create change. And from your actions in life and what you're getting up to, how would you encourage today's youth to have a voice, to stand for their own views, and to really make change in terms of climate change?
Well, I think more generally, just young people have this real capability to create change. We've seen it not just in the climate action movement, but also especially in the US with gun control, and then with women's rights and protecting women and like violence against women. All those protests and those groups, that's young people, and that's young people getting active, and that's young people taking a stand for what they believe in. I think that's such a great thing about the youth of today, is that we're so passionate, and there are a lot of issues in the world, and you just need to decide what the biggest priority is for you and what you want to get involved in. And so I think just deciding what you're passionate about and then seeing how you can get involved is really important. With the climate movement in particular, I would say come along to the strikes. At the moment, there's a lot to be done in terms of bushfire relief. Donations are fantastic if you can raise money in any way, or if you can donate products such as things that firefighters need, such as hydration packs and throat lozenges and all these different things. That's really important too. And there's lots of ways to get involved. You just have to keep an eye out for what's happening.
Yeah, awesome. I just want to finish with this quote that I really love by Martin Luther King, and he stated that he who accepts evil without protesting against it is really cooperating with it.
That's a great quote.
I think that's
Yeah, I think that's awesome, and I think the best way, to thank an activist, because I've seen a lot of adults say to the kids, "You give us hope," and I think the best way to thank an activist, and particularly a child who's having to go out to the streets to defend their future, is to join them.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we would love to talk forever, but unfortunately we're going to have to wrap it up there. Thank you very much, Daisy and Viv, for joining us. We really valued your opinion and your perspective from people who are really fighting for this cause so courageously.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure being on the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
And thank you all for joining us for episode 4 of the Power of Youth podcast. Please stay tuned for next week where we will be discussing the impact of social media on youth. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you.
The Climactic Collective.